In this lesson, we're going to look at ecosystem structure, and then we're going to look at broad types of species, not individual species like cats and dogs, that sort of thing, but broad categories of species. So we have a number of overview questions that we'll be looking at throughout this lesson and the next lesson. We'll look at how are the numbers of species determined in a community, how can we classify species according to their roles, and that's those categories that I was just talking about. And then how do those species interact with one another, how do they change to environmental conditions, and then does high species diversity, biodiversity, increase the stability and sustainability of a community? So we'll look at that, what they call ecosystem inertia, or that ability to resist change. So the first case study that you have that you'll need to look through the text once again and fill in the parts about the case study was about the American alligator. There's also in this lesson, after this video, there's another video about gator holes and what their importance to the rest of the ecosystem is. So the hunters they hunted the alligator, one, because of kind of that fear factor, because, alligators actually are one of those few that really will take people from shorelines and things like that. So there were some species, like wolves, for example, where the whole Little Red Riding Hood story and things like that, they said, oh, well, wolves will drag off small children and babies and things like that. And that was less likely to be true. With an alligator, it really could happen. So there was a definite concern regarding human safety along waterways. Then there was the resource of the alligator itself. So especially in the 17 and 1800s, having alligator skin shoes or accessories like belts and bags and things like that was considered very fashionable. It was also very durable. So if you had alligator skin for your shoes or your boots or something like that, they were going to last a long time. So there was that economic value that contributed to the hunting. But we found out that as the alligator population declined, so did the health of the ecosystems along these waterways. And they actually did have a very important role in those areas. And the video that you'll watch after this talks about gator holes, and they'll show you some examples of gator holes. But basically, the alligator digs a hole to lay in, because they need water to keep them cooled off, because once again, alligators are reptiles, and so they're cold-blooded. They can't regulate their own body temperature. They rely on either going and laying in the sun or going in the shade or going underwater, something like that, in order to cool themselves off. And so gator holes were something that helped them out with that. But these big holes held water in them, and so as water around would dry up, there would be this little water source in there that was beneficial to the rest of the ecosystem. Their nesting mounds that they built to lay their eggs in were then used by other organisms, particularly birds. So they provided habitat for other organisms as well. Through their swimming, because they're rather large critters, they would tear up that vegetation, and that's why it would keep those waterways open and free, which makes them a keystone species. And we'll talk a little bit about what it means to be a keystone species here in just a second. So there's different structures to different biomes or biological communities. And once again, a lot of that has to do with climate, right? It has to do with the amount of rainfall in an area and the temperature in an area. So we looked at biodiversity from the poles down to the equator, and we talked about how at the polar regions, in one of your activities, you looked at how in the polar regions, there's not as much biodiversity. It's a lot more scarce. Temperature is a lot colder. There's not as much available water in the area. And so the plants tend to be lower to the ground, and you have less biodiversity. As you move towards the equator, which is what you're doing if you go this direction on the graph, you get much more complexity in your ecosystems as you increase in water in those areas. So you have some of these areas that are kind of in the middle. So really, as you're moving, this one's not set up as far as latitude is concerned. But your deserts are like your tundra as well, So you have your hot deserts and you have your cold deserts. And we have our grasslands, where we still have shorter amounts of vegetation. We're increasing in biodiversity, but our vegetation can't grow very tall because we still don't have as much water. Our cooler areas, where our coniferous forests are areas like the taiga and those northern forests. So in Canada, in the northern part of the United States, in northern Russia and Eurasia, these are our cone-bearing trees where they get a lot of snow, and so they still get a lot of water, just a lot of it falls in the form of snow. And then as we move a little bit further south in latitude, we get to our deciduous forest, or those trees that lose their leaves. Okay, and then we continue to move a little bit further south and we get to our thorn forest, which is a lot like what we have here. So when we look at some of the types of trees, we have some that's coniferous, so we have our pinyon pine, and then we also have our scrub type forest, where we have our juniper and things like that, which would fall under more of the category of the thorn forest. And then we come down, as you come further towards the equator, as you come down like through Arizona area, you're going to run into our scrub forest, you're going to run into our shortgrass areas and into our desert scrub until you get closer to the equator, and then the amount of rainfall increases, and once again we end up with our big tall vegetation again in the tropical rainforest. So once again, it's all a factor of climate. So it's about the amount of water that an area gets, and the temperature is going to determine the structure of the ecosystem and the amount of diversity that is present. Once we're in our ecosystems, remember we talked about we have different kinds of diversity. We talked about having genetic diversity and species diversity. So we're going to focus on one of those types of diversity right now, and that's our species diversity. And that's going to be determined by two different things. So how many different kinds of individuals is our species richness. So that's usually what people think about when they think about diversity, is how many different kinds there are. But it's also about how many of them there are, and that's the species evenness. So we have to look at both of those things, because you might have a lot of different kinds of species, but if there's only 10 of each of them, then you don't have a great evenness, and you're not going to have as much resilience in your ecosystem as you would if you had, 45 different species, but you had, several thousand of each of them. Then if something happens, you're not necessarily going to lose that entire species. But if I only had 10 of them left, then it's much more likely that something could happen that would be very catastrophic and could cause the species to go extinct. So how those species live within an area is what is considered their niche. So the niche is like the way of life. This is how they interact within the ecosystem. This is everything. It's about what do they eat, who eats them, where do they live, what kind of vegetation, do they nest, do they dig burrows, do they store seeds for the winter, what do they do? That all those things enter into niche structure. And so there's a lot of overlap in the niche structure of different organisms, and how they share those resources is going to determine your species diversity. So we also look at the geographic location, and we just talked about this one a moment ago. So remember we said we're going to talk about some big categories of species, and so we're going to go through some of these terms, and I'll give you some examples of those. So a native species is one that is normally found in a particular area. Now, this is sort of a general term, and it kind of changes over time, because while we look at over what kind of time period are we talking about native? So cattle are not a native species. They're considered a non-native species. They were deliberately introduced into the United States. They came from Spain. So they weren't here. They weren't in the British Isles either, but they were introduced into that particular area as well. They've been here for a really long time, though. So at what point in time do we say, okay, well, this has become now a native species? Mules are not a native species. The wild horses on the Salt River, which have been in the news a lot over the past few years, are not a native species. These were all introduced species that were brought over by European settlers at one point in time, and some of them, like those wild horses down on the Salt River, have escaped. And so people consider them, well, they're native to this area. Well, they're really not. They're not native. They were introduced species. So when we talk about native in our desert Southwest area, you know, the saguaro cactus is a native species. Our choyas and our prickly pears and our cactus wren and our Harris hawks and our those ones and the bald eagles, those are organisms that were here, they evolved here on their own, or they migrated here on their own. They were not brought in by people. And that's usually the biggest difference between native and non-native. When we get into the non-native, some things we bring on purpose, like the horses and things like that, and some things we bring on accident. A good example of that are mussels that attach to the bottoms of ships. And so as ships go from country to country, for example, going from Asia coming over to the United States, if they don't check the bottoms of their boats, and those mussels start to attach onto, you know, to fall off of the ships or something like that, or they reproduce and they spread their young here, then we don't have anything that will eat them, and so that becomes an issue when we talk about non-native species, and we'll go into that in a little bit greater detail in a little bit. We also have indicator species. So we've got our native species, our non-native species, we've got our indicator species. These indicator species tend to not be very resilient. They tend to react quite quickly to changes in their environment. So it could be temperature or oxygen. Birds are another really good indicator species. They die off really easily. And so if something were to change in their environment, if that species starts to decline, then we know that something is wrong, and that it's happening pretty quickly. We have keystone species, and there's another video after the one about the alligators about otters, who are a keystone species in addition to, you can see here the sea star and the dung beetle. And the keystone, so the term keystone comes from architecture actually. So if you can imagine an arch in a building in like an old church or something like that. So at the top of an arch that was built with stone, there would be one piece of stone at the top of the arch that looked kind of like this. And then you come down the rest of the side and you'd have the stone coming down this way and the stone coming down that way. And when they would build it, they would build it coming up this way, they'd build it coming up this way, they'd have it supported as they were building it, like with a frame. And then they'd put in this keystone, and it would kind of lock it all together. And if you took away the form and then you took out the keystone, the whole arch would fall down. And that's kind of the idea behind the keystone species. This is a species that's so important to a community that if we were to remove it, like this keystone here, the whole ecosystem would collapse. And so and a lot of times we don't realize the importance of that species until later on. And we'll be looking at the wolves in Yellowstone as an example. There's a little video clip about the otters as well. Foundation species is another type of important species. And these ones, excuse me, they're kind of like the keystone species, but they really just make the environment better for the critters that are around them. And so there's the next video after the one about the otters is one about elephants, who are a good example of foundation species. And if you've never seen an elephant push over a tree, it's kind of cool. And then you think about, you know, like, what's in this elephant's head? Like, why is the elephant just, because literally it's going to randomly like walk up to the tree and just shove it over. So, which is kind of cool to watch, but it's like, what is the elephant thinking? Because we know that elephants are intelligent. They can be constrained, they can communicate, we know they're intelligent animals. So I just wish we could get inside their head somehow and be like, okay, why are you doing this? Because it really doesn't benefit the elephant at all. It doesn't do anything for them. I mean, their trunks are tall enough, they could have pulled the leaves off the trees if they'd really wanted to while that tree was standing. They didn't need to push it down in order for that to happen. And so, but it does open up the environment for grasses to come in, which is important for other species. So it actually they kind of thin the forest out. But once again, they don't really eat the grass. And so they're not making their own habitat better, they're just making other critters' habitat better. So it's an interesting video, so give it a look.